Hey, it's Scott Jordan and Mark Warner for the Thursday, December 3rd COVID update. And let's take these off since we are socially distanced. So, Mark, we haven't done a COVID update in a while. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving and everybody else out there had a good Thanksgiving.
It was wonderful, actually, and it was a reprieve from doing a COVID update. So,
Yes, for those of you that were looking for one last week, we decided to take a little break with the holidays and everything else. So good to be back in the saddle, even though, things are kind of changing a little bit. We got the vaccines and everything else potentially happening. So it's positive stuff, right?
right. Well, I mean, that's kind of the big thing that we had said during the last COVID update is if something really crazy came along, we were going to do a mad rush to get a COVID-19 update out. But luckily, things stayed relatively calm for the year
Yeah.
2020 and allowed everybody to have a little time with Thanksgiving and spend time with family. But since then, of course, news has been pouring in and there's been a lot of news.
Yeah, well, let's get to it. First off, I want to bring everybody up to date on supply chain situations here. Bullen over the Thanksgiving break, we were installing epoxy floors and a bunch of other stuff up in the production area, and we've added. I guess the quart line will be done this week. We have a brand new quart line that we've purchased, very expensive, with all the induction sealers, a capper, and everything else, and it's been on order for about 4 months. So we have that, and then we've also added a additional bag-in-a-box line. So we're going to significantly increase our production capabilities in quarts and bag-in-a-box. So that's really, really good news overall, because that's kind of where some of our issues have been with keeping up with the amount of business. So that's good.
It's a wonderful thing, actually. It's been, we've talked about this before. 2020 has been full of a lot of challenges for lots of folks, but also, with challenges, there's always hidden opportunities. And for us, it created an opportunity to expand a little bit to be able to handle the increased demand. And that will influence the future of Bullen for years to come. So that's kind of a positive.
And the other good news in the supply chain is we have more wipes. Eric 75 wipes are coming. So talk to your account manager. They should be here next week. They are supplied on an allocation basis because we don't have an unlimited supply. But what's up with wipes anyway, Mark?
The biggest thing is the question that I'm often asked is, how come I see baby wipes in the grocery store, or I see furniture polish wipes, in the car parts store, but we're having such difficulty getting disinfectant wipes? And it all boils down to the fact that not every form of wipe material is actually approved for the use with a disinfectant wipe.
Yep, I get samples all the time saying, yeah, we can supply you with as much of this as you need. And I was like, really? That's fantastic. I wonder why you have so much of that. And it ends up that this stuff doesn't work with quats. Why is that? Explain, Dr. Mark, explain explain what quat binding is.
So let me.
I mean, to put you on that. It's not even at our show notes.
I need to put on my stethoscope. I should have one as a prop. But the issue has to do with something called quat binding.
Right.
And one of the things you worry about is that the organic material in wipes, cottons, and certain types of cellulose have the ability to bind some of the active quat agents, which now reduces the amount of active quat available to do the job of combating germs and viruses. So that's called quat binding. It's been a long-term issue, Scott. It's not new. It's something people have dealt with cotton mops. One of the reasons why the industry got away from pure cotton mops into synthetics and synthetic blends and microfiber blends, all of that was a movement away from the pure cottons that were used 20 years ago. And quat binding is one of the issues that people are concerned about with wipes. If they're using it for a disinfectant, you want to use a disinfectant that you're sure is killing what you think you're doing.
Yeah.
And with all that said, there's still a process you have to use when you apply a disinfectant with a wipe. And
You just wipe it. It's a wipe. So you just pull it out the canister and you go like that, and it's all done, just like that.
that's my biggest concern. Now, I do get why there's an appeal for maybe workers inside a building during their shift in between terminal clean operations or very aggressive disinfection operations, maybe once a day, that they have some way to maintain their work area during the day. Students have been asked to do that in schools and colleges.
Yeah.
So I get the idea of a wipe because you don't have any liquid that's sitting around and having to have proper training on how to apply and use that. But my bigger concern is that we're not seeing people using this stuff right.
No, no.
It doesn't change the fact that there is a best practice, and the best practice in applying a disinfectant includes, which is called step 2, of applying it heavy enough that it's going to stay wet long enough to meet the EPA registered dwell time requirement.
Yeah.
If it's not meeting that required time, you're not performing the disinfection process properly.
Right.
So that's something that you and I wanted to chat about today, and that's best practices versus worst practices. And worst practice that you could look at is trying to use a disinfectant without allowing it to have the proper stay wet time or dwell time. And wipes tend to create that crutch. It's kind of like that shortcut where I'm just wiping it down. I ought to be good to go, right? Well, no, not really. It's a ease of application, I suppose, but it still has to be applied heavy enough to stay wet.
Well, and if you depending upon what the product is and the proper dwell time, if it's a minute, that's relatively easy, I think. But if you're talking with a product that maybe is 3 minutes or 5 minutes, I mean, we've done all the videos and testing of spray systems. It's difficult to get, even when you're spraying the chemical down, to get something to stay wet for 5 minutes. And a wipe is, when you pull it out of the canister, it's not dripping wet. They're designed so if you have a roll like this, it's calculated how much chemical to saturate the roll properly. But quite honestly, I don't see how, in most cases, if it's a 3-minute dwell time, how's it possibly going to keep it wet long enough?
Well, some of the news reports that we've seen coming out and some of the major media outlets have been talking about processes and procedures for fighting COVID-19 properly. Wipes come up in that conversation, and very often people will go out of their way to make a point that you need to not just use one wipe and do your entire house. By the time you've gotten, after 3 or 4 surfaces, it's very likely that it's barely damp anymore.
Yeah.
So it's not leaving any wetness. So the recommendation on use of wipes is you need to use a lot of them, because it's only really fully wet when it's first pulled off of or out of the container. So that's like one of the worst practices that kind of pops up, and it's people just trying to pull a shortcut.
We're still seeing a lot of stories. In fact, there's just one in the Wall Street Journal, which we'll put in a link here, about the health risks of disinfectants. And I know we've talked about that before, Mark.
Yeah, so that pops up a lot, and there's a valid reason to be concerned about disinfectants in general. Years ago, we worked with things called phenol, which was a derivative of carbolic acid. Heck, it was aggressive enough to corrode stainless steel. It would pull pigment out of your skin. So there are a lot of very, very nasty and aggressive disinfectants. 2 of the safest ones that are out there tend to be hydrogen peroxide and quats. And I'm bringing up quats because back in the day, quats were introduced as being a far safer yet highly effective approach for going after surfaces in hospitals and healthcare.
Yeah.
And so that is the area that we tend to favor these days, is dealing with things like peroxides and quats, even products that contain some bleach content. Those are pretty common. The ones that had things like glutaraldehyde and phenols and all that kind of stuff, we're kind of glad to have seen them go
Yeah.
by the wayside, just because they were so corrosive and somewhat of a health risk. But with all that said, when these are used properly in their proper diluted state, they're very safe to work with.
Yeah. Yeah. You, Mark, you had commented about the Wall Street Journal article. It's a little video / article, and the gentleman that was doing the hosting was talking about using bleach in the household situation, where if you had trouble getting disinfectant, which is not a bad idea if you're okay working with bleach. I mean, it has bad odor, doesn't smell good and all that, but you noted that the dilution rate that they were suggesting in there wasn't even the correct one for disinfection.
No, they were actually promoting a 1:100 ratio on household bleach, which is effective as a sanitizer. It's a solution that's maybe many of us get close to when we're adding a cup of bleach to our laundry. But when you're dealing with bleach as a disinfectant, with household bleach, that's a 1 to 10. And at 1 to 10, it's, you're working with it at 1 to 10. It's a strong odor that occurs at that level.
Yeah, and
But
not all bleaches are rated as disinfectants either. Particularly some of the household bleaches. Well, actually, bleach in general loses its strength rather rapidly once the container's open. So even if you're mixing it properly, you got to make sure you got a product that actually has the EPA registration number and it's a disinfectant bleach. And then secondly, if you've had a bottle of bleach laying in your laundry area for 6 months, it might not even have enough active content.
yeah,
Right?
it could be toast at that point. In
Yeah.
fact, major chemical companies that do produce bleach-based disinfectants, what makes them technically more expensive than some of the value bleach lines you see at the grocery store is they've gone through the effort to stabilize that bleach, to make sure that it doesn't degrade at such a rapid rate so that it still has the ability to kill. And that's why there's a difference in pricing on that. But with all that said, one of the other issues that's popped up a lot, Scott, is the issue about if we're going in and we're constantly spraying down areas and we're picking up somewhat of a sticky tacky residue as a result of that, it's an indication that somebody is not working with best practices. That's worst practices. Best practices requires as a first step that you pre-clean the surface, give it a wipe down. If you do that and then you apply your chemical, whether it's bleach or quat or peroxides or any of the other actives, if you do that, you are only getting a buildup of that one application if you're doing a wipe down prior to each spray.
Right.
And then, of course, what they look for generally as a best practice is ideally, it's best if you can pick up the excess slurry after the dwell time has gone by.
Yep.
And even better than that, give it a rinse. Now, that's required by law in certain environments like food service and food processing, but it is still a very shrewd and proper way to go after the use of disinfectants, maybe in your own home. Because if you do tabletops and you have bare arms on your tabletops, it makes sense that you would remove any kind of residue that might cause an irritation. So that's best practice, and it's really what we'd want to see people doing. Tied into that is a question as to what that sticky residue is. Is it purely just chemical residue, or is it picking up soil as well? And we've all dealt with this with resoiling in carpets, where a sticky residue causes a spot to appear as though it's coming back and reoccurring, but it's really fresh soil on the residue left behind by a spotting agent that wasn't rinsed, right? So we can have that same issue on surfaces and that soil. It could actually end up being a food source for bacteria or a place for viruses to attach themselves to. So it could become a bigger issue. That's why best practices are what they are and why we're referring to all that as worst practice. So it boils down to having a proper marriage between the right products and having the right knowledge on how to use it.
Yeah, well, we're getting there. It's only we've only been doing this for a few months, so we'll get it down.
Well, it is kind of amazing if you go back to 2019, how little people really knew about this stuff. It's kind of amazing how much of an appetite there has been with the public to learn about how do I do this right and what's the right stuff to use. So I'm really encouraged by all that. I would say that the human race has evolved 10,000 years in the last 6 months in their knowledge of how to keep themselves clean and create a hygienic environment.
Well, there's a good reason for that. Is that like people kind of like to live, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So when it comes down to
minor
life,
minor detail.
yeah, life or death tends to get everybody's attention. So
But so
anyway, those were key things we wanted to cover today,
yep.
Scott.
One more thing, because I went to, on germwashing.com. Don't forget that, folks. They're listening in, and we're still looking, or always looking for stuff that we can research for you, debunk, or if it's real, we can say it's real too. But one of the things I thought was great that we post up there is the WHO COVID myth page, and I went down the myth, the list of myths, and the big one that I saw was people should not be wearing masks while exercising. Which I thought was great that somebody finally put that out, because you see some people out running down the street or wherever with a mask on, and then a whole bunch of people not. So if you're not running next to the person, it's not necessary. They actually say people should not wear a mask when exercising, as masks may reduce the ability to breathe comfortably, which I guess the ability to breathe is important.
I would say that probably explains why there appears to be so many people taking a snooze laying next to the jogging track.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not taking a snooze. Maybe they just passed out.
Yeah. And then they also go on to say that sweat can make the mask become wet more quickly, which makes it even more difficult to breathe. So good news, folks. You can, in fact, let's put them on since the show's over. Mark and I are going to go out and jog around the block now. So thanks for tuning in. And if we have some good news, if we have new news next week, maybe you'll see us on next week's COVID video update. So thanks very much, Mark.
Thanks,
you for
everybody.
tuning in.